The wind kicked up and she scrubbed harder. Dust rode the hills in waves of brown and gray, a ghost army marching on the ranch house. But the little girl didn't flinch. She didn't pause. She didn't even squint. Her tiny fingers were cracked from lye and cold water, raw and red against the worn wood of the brush. Every board of that long, sun-bleached porch had seen her tears at one point or another. But not today. Today she didn't have time to cry. Today she had to finish. She had to finish before someone shouted, before a heavy hand found her shoulder, because if she didn't, that man inside might send her back to the home, the place where they forgot your name. Her name was Ruthie. She was 8, maybe 9. She wasn't sure anymore. They stopped counting birthdays at the orphanage once your mama stopped visiting, and Ruthie's mama had stopped visiting a long, long time ago. She remembered the sound of a lullaby more than she remembered a face. All she knew for sure was the sting of cold mornings, the taste of sour porridge, and work. Always the work that never stopped. When the pastor's wife herded them onto the wagon, she said they were going to be useful. Sent them out to this ranch, a place of endless sky and dirt. Ruthie thought maybe she'd get to learn cows or ride a fence line. She'd dreamed of horses, of feeling wind in her hair for a reason other than it was trying to knock her over. But Ruthie hadn't touched a horse since she got here. Instead, she swept. The other girls didn't last. 2 of them ran off just 2 days in. One squeezed under the fence line and made it all the way to town before they caught her. The other got caught trying to steal biscuits and was hauled back in the same wagon that brought them, crying the whole way. Ruthie stayed. Not because she liked the place. Not because the work was fair. She stayed because a cold, hard knot in her gut told her something. It whispered to her in the dark, "If you leave again, no one will look for you next time." And she believed it. The porch creaked behind her, a single sharp sound that cut through the wind. She froze, her small knuckles whitening around the brush handle. Her chin dropped, her eyes finding a familiar spot on the wood by her knees. It was a knot in the plank, twisted into the shape of a heart. She stared at it now like it was a shield, like it could somehow protect her from what she knew was coming. A boot step. Slow, measured. Then his voice, low and rough like gravel. "You've been at that same spot for near 20 minutes, girl." Ruthie swallowed the lump in her throat. She nodded without looking up. "I'll do better, sir." He was silent for a moment. She could feel his shadow falling over her, blocking the weak sun. "You ain't supposed to be here at all," he said, his voice flat. "Thought you were headed back with the others." "I wasn't sent back," she whispered to the floorboards. The silence stretched, long and heavy. It felt like an eternity. Then she felt the brush lift right out of her hands. He'd taken it. His shadow passed over her completely as he moved to the porch rail. "What's your name again?" he asked, not looking at her. She hesitated. A name was something you could lose. "Ruthie." "Ruthie what?" Her throat went dry. I don't know, sir." That silence again. Longer this time. When she finally dared to lift her eyes from the floor, she saw him proper. She hadn't before. Not really. The man who owned the ranch, Colt Townsend, wasn't the kind of man who made conversation. He ran the whole sprawling place with just 2 ranch hands and a frown that seemed carved into his face. The only reason she even knew his name was because someone had whispered it in terror that first morning. They said he'd lost his wife in a barn fire a year back. They said he didn't speak to God anymore. They said he didn't speak to anyone unless it was to issue an order. And now he was staring down at her. His eyes were gray and worn out, like old river stones. He was looking at her like she was a stray mutt he'd found on his land, one he didn't quite know what to do with. "You eat today?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "No, sir." "Why not?" I didn't want to take more than was mine," she mumbled. The men were still at the table. His mouth twitched, just a little, like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Then, without another sound, he turned and walked back inside the house, the screen door slapping shut behind him. Ruthie waited. She didn't dare move. Was this it? Was he going to pack her a bag, call the wagon? Her heart hammered against her ribs. She braced herself. Then she heard a sound, quiet but clear. The soft clink of ceramic on wood. A plate. It was sitting on the porch beside her. On it was a single biscuit, still steaming, a pat of butter melting on top. She stared at it. She stared at it like it was a trick, like it might vanish if she blinked too long. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "You gonna eat it or stare at it till it cools?" His voice came from just inside the door, muffled by the screen. She didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed it in both hands, her cracked fingers barely feeling the heat. She nodded, even though he couldn't possibly see her. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. The door shut again, for good this time. That night the bunkhouse was empty and cold. The other girls were long gone. Ruthie found a pile of old hay in the tool shed, a place that smelled of rust and oil and earth. She curled up, pulling a burlap sack over her thin frame, and tried not to cry. She'd stayed. She hadn't run. But she had no idea what that meant. Was she a prisoner? Or was she just here? The next morning she was back on the porch, sweeping. No one came out to stop her. No one came out to yell. Around noon she saw him, Colt. He was on horseback out by the far gate, a silhouette against the endless sky. He didn't wave, he didn't call out, but he looked at her. Just once. A long, steady look. And that was enough to keep her sweeping. 2 days passed like that, then 3, then a week. The silence of the ranch became a kind of language. She learned its rhythms. She was doing more than sweeping now. The older ranch hand, a man named Jeb, threw his back out, so Ruthie started feeding the chickens. She figured out how to mend the torn feed sacks with twine she found. There was a mare in the stable that no one else could get near. A big, mean-eyed horse that would kick and bite. But Ruthie just stood quiet beside her. She didn't flinch when the horse snorted or pawed the ground. She just whispered to it. Not words, really. More like the memory of that lullaby she couldn't quite place. A rhythm of calm, a sound of safety. Colt watched her sometimes. He never got close. He'd stand by the fence or watch from the kitchen window. He never said a word. But one morning, she found something by the shed door. A pair of boots. Not new, not by a long shot. But they weren't full of holes either. And they were just her size. She slipped them on, the worn leather cool against her skin, and she had to fight to keep from smiling. It was the first gift she'd ever received that wasn't a punishment in disguise. By the second week, a routine had set in. Ruthie woke before sunrise. She stirred the stove to life before the ranch hands stumbled in, their faces still creased with sleep. She learned how to crack eggs with one hand. She knew which chickens laid early and which ones would peck you if you reached too fast. She didn't eat unless Colt told her to. She didn't rest unless he gave a slight nod in her direction. She didn't speak unless she was spoken to. But something was shifting. He started speaking to her more, and it wasn't always to give orders. "What do you dream about?" he asked her once. He'd caught her staring up at the vast, empty sky before chores, her face tilted up to the dawn. She hesitated, startled by the question. No one had ever asked her that before. She shrugged, feeling small. "A bed," she said finally, "with a quilt, one that smells like lavender." He just nodded once, his face unreadable, and didn't speak of it again. But the next week, the rain came. A hard, cold, relentless downpour that turned the ranch to mud. The tin roof of the tool shed leaked. Water dripped down in a steady, miserable rhythm. Ruthie curled up in the driest corner she could find, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to stay warm. The thunder rattled her bones. She tried humming that lullaby, the one she sang to the horse, but the sound wouldn't come. All she could do was count the seconds between the flash of lightning and the deafening crack of thunder. 1, 2, 3. The shed door creaked open. He stood there, a black shape against the gray storm. Rain slid off the brim of his hat. His face was a mask of shadows, You can't stay out here, he said. She blinked up at him, her eyes wide. It's all right, sir. It ain't, he said, his voice firm. Get inside. She followed him without a word. She'd never been past the kitchen before. The house was dark and quiet, filled with the sound of the storm and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. He led her down that hall and opened a door. It was a small room, simple, but inside was a bed, a real bed, with a thick quilt folded at the end. She walked to it in silence, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor. She reached out and touched the edge of the quilt, half expecting it to vanish. It was soft. In the dim light, she could see a pattern of tiny flowers stitched into the fabric. It's clean, he said from the doorway. His voice was low. I'll expect it to stay that way. Yes, sir, she whispered. He closed the door behind him, leaving her alone in the room. She didn't sleep at first. She just lay there, her eyes wide open, hands tucked beneath her chin, listening to the storm rage outside. And as the rain hammered against the window, she thought she could smell it. Faint, but there. Lavender. The next morning when she woke up, a dress was hanging on the back of the chair. It wasn't fancy, just a simple cotton dress, blue like a summer sky, but it was clean, and it was hers. Ruthie had no idea what had changed, only that something had. He didn't say she was staying, he didn't say she was going, but each day that passed, she was still there. She was a fixture now, like the fence posts or the water pump, a part of the ranch. She even caught a calf that had slipped its pen. The little thing was bolting for the creek, and without thinking, Ruthie just launched herself at it, tackling it into the mud. She held on with her whole weight, mud and grass staining her new dress, until one of the ranch hands came running. The men laughed, a deep, rumbling sound, but Colt didn't. He walked over, pulled her out of the mud by the back of her dress, and looked her over with those serious gray eyes. You all right? He asked. Just muddy, sir, she said, spitting out a piece of grass. Next time, he said, his voice stern, yell for help. Yes, sir. But that night, he left a small tin of peppermint leaves by the sink. She knew they were for bruises. She rubbed them on her sore arms and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the peppermint. And then came the letter. Colt read it once, standing by the kitchen window. Then he read it again, his jaw tightening. He folded it carefully, tucked it into his pocket, and went to find her. She was in the barn, scrubbing out a water trough. They're sending someone, he said, his voice flat. She looked up from the bucket, her small hands dripping with water. Someone? From the orphanage, he said, to collect you. Her mouth went dry. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. No, not back there. Anything but that. They say it's not proper, you staying here, he continued, his eyes on the far wall of the barn. Not without papers, not without family. She just nodded, too stunned to speak. The scrub brush fell from her hand and splashed into the bucket. He finally looked at her. His gray eyes were intense. You want to go back? She shook her head, hard. A single tear escaped and rolled down her dusty cheek. I didn't think so, he muttered. He didn't say anything more. But that night, she heard him, pacing, back and forth on the long front porch. She heard the creak of his boots on the floorboards, the sound of a quiet sigh, and then, sometime before the sun came up, the distinct sound of paper tearing. When she stepped out onto the porch in the morning, the letter was gone. And in the cast-iron stove in the kitchen, a small pile of ash sat on top of the old coals. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee mug. He said nothing. But that afternoon, when one of the horses kicked a rail loose on the fence, she scrambled to fix it, her small hands struggling with the heavy wood, the rope blistering her palms. He came over, silent as always. He lifted her up in one strong arm, setting her aside as if she weighed nothing at all. He fixed the rail himself in 3 swift movements. Then he looked down at her and said, his voice quiet but firm, You're not going anywhere, Ruthie. And that's when she cried. Not loud, sobbing cries. just quiet, steady tears that she couldn't stop. He noticed. He put a hand on her head, just for a second, and he didn't say a word. The sky turned red that evening. It bled color across the hills, a deep, angry crimson, like it had something to warn them about. Ruthie stood by the fence, her fingers curled around the top rail, watching the wind drag dust across the long grass. Something in her gut was tight, a familiar knot. It was the feeling she got right before something changed, right before the world decided to rip itself apart again. It didn't matter how warm the quilt was, or how many days had passed since she last feared the dark. Something was coming, and she could feel it in her bones. Inside, Colt Townsend stood in front of the fireplace. The flames licked at the logs, but they offered no warmth. The letter he'd burned still echoed in his mind, the words seared there like a brand. He hadn't told her everything. He hadn't told her the worst of it. The letter hadn't just said someone from the orphanage was coming. It said they were demanding she be returned. It said she was wrongfully placed. That was the phrase they used, wrongfully placed. It claimed she wasn't listed on any official orphanage ledger, that there was no record of a Ruthie being assigned to his county at all. It said she'd been brought out to the ranch by mistake. He'd burned that letter, yes. But the man who wrote it, some administrator with a cruel name, wasn't going to stop with parchment and ink. The letter had promised a follow-up, in person, a county marshal, and he was bringing proof. Colt hadn't said a word of it to Ruthie. What could he say? The world thinks you don't exist, so they want to put you back in the box where they forgot you? He watched her through the window. Every morning, she was out there before the rooster crowed. She swept the porch. She fed the chickens. She gathered the eggs and folded her own laundry in the small room he'd given her, never needing to be told. She didn't ask for toys. She didn't ask for stories. All she ever seemed to ask for, with her quiet work and her steady presence, was to be allowed to stay. And he hadn't said yes, but he hadn't said no either. He hadn't known what to say. He was a man of fences and cattle, not of children and feelings. He couldn't remember the exact moment it had shifted inside him. Maybe it was watching her curl her small arms around a sack of flour that was far too heavy for her, her face set in a grim line of determination, refusing to let go until it was safely inside. Maybe it was when she'd told Jeb, the ranch hand, not to swat the horse too hard, even though that same animal had kicked the fence post that nearly hit her. Or maybe it was just the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. A quick, hopeful glance, like she was trying to memorize his face, trying to weave herself so deeply into the fabric of the ranch that no one could ever pull her out again. He saw her now from the window standing by the fence. Her dress was too thin for the cold evening wind. Her small arms looked pale against the dark wood of the rail. Her eyes were scanning the horizon, scanning the long, empty road, like she was waiting for someone to ride up and take it all away. Colt clenched his jaw. He couldn't stand it. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The wind was sharp. "Wind's kicking up," he said, his voice gruff. Ruthie nodded but didn't turn around. "Feels like change," she said, her voice small against the gusts. He grunted. "You're a mite too young to be sounding like an old woman." She glanced back at him then, and for a second, she almost smiled. "You feel it too." It wasn't a question. He sighed and leaned against the post beside her. Both of them were facing the horizon now, like they were two soldiers staring down an approaching army. "There's talk of a marshal coming," he said quietly, deciding then and there that she deserved the truth. "Someone from the county, about you." She went perfectly still. The life seemed to drain from her face. He didn't sugarcoat it. "They say you weren't assigned here proper, that you weren't on the books." "But I was on the wagon," she whispered, her voice trembling. "With the other girls. I didn't sneak on. The pastor's wife, she told me to go." "I know," he said. He looked down at her small, fierce face. "I believe you." Her voice was barely audible now. Do they want to take me back?" Colt didn't answer right away. He stared out at the dusty road. Then he muttered, "They're going to try." She breathed in sharp, a tiny, wounded sound. Her eyes were watering, but her jaw was firm. "What if I run?" "Then they'll chase you," he said. "You run once, they'll never stop watching you again. You'll spend your whole life looking over your shoulder." She turned to him then, her small face suddenly fierce in a way he had never seen before. "I'll hide," she declared. "I know this ranch better than they do. I'll go down to the gulch. I'll sleep in the hayloft. They won't find me." He crouched down then, so he was at her level. He took her small, bony shoulders in his big, calloused hands. "You shouldn't have to hide, Ruthie." Her bottom lip trembled, but she nodded, fighting back the tears. "Then what do we do?" she whispered. He looked into her wide, terrified eyes and said the thing that had been building in his chest for weeks, a feeling he hadn't even had a name for until now. "We fight it," he said, "the right way." "But I ain't yours," she whispered back, the words laced with a lifetime of abandonment. Not by law, not even by accident. He let go of her shoulders and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was creased and worn. "I filed this yesterday," he said, his voice thick. He unfolded it. It was a legal form. "Name change, guardianship request. They'll try to stop it, but if I can get Judge Harrow in town to sign it first—" Her hands flew to her mouth. Her eyes were wide with a disbelief so profound it was painful to watch. You want to keep me?" He gave the smallest of nods. "Ain't right sending you back," he mumbled, looking away. "Not after what I've seen in you." "But you don't even know me." He stood up straight then, his voice suddenly firm, as if he were arguing a point with himself as much as with her. "I know you finish what you start. I know you don't lie about what you've done. I know you'd rather go hungry than take what ain't offered. That's more than I can say about half the men I've ever hired." Her eyes brimmed, and this time she didn't fight it. You'd be my guardian?" "If you'll have me," he said gruffly. She didn't answer with words. She just ran to him, a small, desperate blur, and flung her arms around his waist, burying her face in the rough fabric of his coat. He stood stiffly for a moment, surprised by the contact. Then, slowly, he rested a hand on her back, on her small, trembling shoulders. She didn't see the way his other hand, still in his pocket, clenched around another letter. A new one. The one that had arrived after he burned the first. The one that said the marshal wasn't just coming. He would arrive within 2 days, with an order of removal, signed and sealed. They had 48 hours. The next morning was colder than any before it. Frost painted the barn roof like delicate white lace, and Ruthie's breath steamed in little puffs as she filled the chicken feeders. Her sleeves were rolled up, her thin arms covered in goosebumps, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. She worked faster now, with a new kind of focused energy, a purpose. Inside the house, Colt sat at the kitchen table with an old friend. The man's name was Bragg. He used to be the county deputy before he retired, a man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. He still had connections. He still knew how the world worked. Colt unrolled the guardianship document on the table. The ink was still fresh. "Think Harrow will sign it?" Bragg scratched his gray beard. "He might. He's always liked you, Colt, but once that marshal shows up with an official order, the judge's hands will be tied. This needs to be filed and signed by tonight, or it's just ink on paper. It won't mean a damn thing." "I'll write in myself," Colt said, his jaw set. "And leave the girl here alone?" Bragg's eyes narrowed. "She's stronger than she looks," Colt insisted. "She may be strong, but she's a child," Bragg said, his voice low and serious. "You ride into town, and something goes wrong. You get delayed. That marshal shows up. She's alone, Colt. Think about that." Colt looked toward the window. He could see Ruthie hauling a bucket of water from the pump, her new boots caked in mud, her face set with that stubborn determination that made her look far older than she was. She wasn't just doing a chore. She was defending her home. "I don't have a choice," Colt said, his voice barely a whisper. That evening, as dusk began to settle, Ruthie saw him packing a saddlebag, a blanket, a canteen, the folded paper. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice small. She stood in the doorway of the barn, her heart sinking. "Just till morning," he said, not looking at her. "Got to deliver something important." She nodded slowly. "Promise you'll come back?" He finally stopped what he was doing and turned to her. He knelt down so they were eye to eye. "You have my word, Ruthie." She hesitated, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. "They might come early." "They won't," he said, trying to sound certain. "But if they do, if someone comes, should I hide?" He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, crudely carved object. It was a horse, whittled from a piece of dark wood. It was rough, clearly handmade, with deep grooves where the knife had slipped. "This was mine when I was your age," he said, pressing it into her palm. Her fingers closed around it. It was still warm from his pocket. "Keep it with you. Don't let anyone take it." She clutched it like it was made of solid gold. "I won't." He stood, gave her one last nod, and led his horse out into the growing darkness. She watched him ride off under the rising moon until he was just a speck on the horizon, swallowed by the night. Ruthie didn't sleep. She couldn't. She sat in the armchair by the front window, the little wooden horse held tight in her lap, and stared out into the dark. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. The knock came just before dawn. It wasn't a gentle knock. It was sharp, heavy, authoritative. 3 loud raps that seemed to shake the entire house. Ruthie froze. Her blood ran cold. She crept to the door, her heart hammering so loud she was sure he could hear it. She peered through the tiny crack between the door and the frame. A man stood on the porch, a tall stranger, wearing a long coat and a flat-brimmed hat. In the first faint light of dawn, she saw something glint on his chest. A badge. He knocked again, harder this time. "Open up! County Marshal!" She backed away from the door, her breath catching in her throat. Then came the voice, calm, professional, and colder than the morning air. "Marshal Larrick, I have an order for the removal of a minor known as Ruthie. I know you're in there. Open this door." She didn't think. She just ran. Through the kitchen, out the back door, her bare feet pounding on the cold, hard-packed dirt. She ran for the only place she could think of. The barn. Her legs shook. Her lungs burned. She slid under a huge pile of loose hay in the corner, burrowing deep, the smell of dust and sweet grass filling her nose. Dirt pressed against her cheek. The little wooden horse dug into the palm of her hand. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Then heavy boots thudded on the wooden floor of the barn. He was inside. "Ruthie Townsend," the marshal called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The name sent a strange jolt through her. Ruthie Townsend. He'd used Colt's name. "You're being returned to the custody of the state. This is not your home." She held her breath. She tried to make herself smaller, to melt into the hay. The hay shifted above her. He was poking it with something. A stick? The barrel of a gun? She bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. Then another voice, sharp and angry. Not the marshal's. "You've got no right to be here, Larrick." It was Bragg, Colt's friend. He must have been watching the house all night. "I've got orders, Bragg," the marshal snapped, "signed by the district. And I've got the authority to delay the execution of those orders until a pending legal matter is resolved," Bragg shot back. "You're retired," the marshal scoffed. "You've got no authority." "Still got friends in high places," Bragg said, his voice dangerously calm. "Judge Harrow is reviewing Colt Townsend's guardianship request right this minute. You take that girl, you're interfering with a pending adoption case. And the judge won't like that. Not one bit." The barn went deadly still. Ruthie could hear the wind whistling through a crack in the wall. "You trying to stop me, old man?" the marshal asked, his voice low and threatening. "I'm buying time," Bragg said evenly. "That's all. Colt will be back by noon. You want to make this ugly before then? That's on your head." The marshal didn't respond, but Ruthie heard something else. A new sound, faint at first, then growing louder. Hoofbeats, fast, coming from the direction of town. Colt. Like a shot, Ruthie burst from the hay pile, straw flying everywhere, tears streaming down her face. She saw him just as he was dismounting, his horse lathered in sweat. He saw her. She ran to him, a desperate, frantic run, and threw her arms around his waist just like she had the night before. But this time, she didn't just hold on. She clung to him, her small body shaking with relief. Colt looked up from her, his face grim, and stared at the marshal. "You can turn around and ride back to town now, Larrick." He said it not as a request, but as a fact. "That paper is signed." The marshal didn't move. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Then Bragg stepped forward from the shadows of the barn. He was holding a folded document. He handed it to the marshal. "Official seal," Bragg said with a grim satisfaction. "Legal guardianship. You can take it up with Judge Harrow if you like, but as of this morning, this girl has a father." The marshal snatched the paper, his eyes scanning it furiously. He muttered something under his breath, a curse that was swallowed by the wind. He crumpled the paper in his fist, threw it to the ground, and turned without another word. He mounted his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Ruthie watched him go, her eyes wide. When he was finally gone, a tiny speck disappearing over the hill, she looked up at Colt. Her voice was a fragile whisper. Am I really yours now?" He crouched beside her, his tired eyes softening for the first time. "You were mine," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "The moment I saw you trying to fix that broken rail with your bare hands." She held up the small wooden horse, its surface now smooth from her desperate grip. "I didn't let go." "I know," he said, and for the very first time he smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "I know you didn't." Colt didn't speak of the marshal again. Not that morning, not that week. The man was gone, a bad dream that had faded with the sunrise. That night, Ruthie slept in the room with the lavender-scented quilt, her head on a soft pillow, the door closed against the world. She was Ruthie Townsend now. It said so on a piece of paper. But a piece of paper couldn't erase the past. And even though she was safe, safe wasn't always the same as settled. In the days that followed, she woke earlier than usual. She pushed herself harder, sweeping the porch until it was spotless, mending sacks that weren't even torn, staying longer in the barn, long after the lamps had been extinguished. The little wooden horse never left her pocket. Sometimes she would find her hand closed around it without even realizing she'd reached for it. It was a reminder, a talisman, a small, hard piece of proof that everything could vanish in the blink of an eye if you let your guard down. Peace was a stranger, and she had learned not to trust strangers. Colt noticed. He wasn't a man for coddling, but he had eyes. He saw the new tightness in Ruthie's shoulders, the way her voice had grown softer, her footsteps quieter. It was like she was trying to take up less space in the world, afraid that even the air around her might report her if she made too much sound. She was a ghost haunting her own home, and that haunted him more than the memory of the fire, more than the long, silent years. This wasn't just a girl who needed a roof over her head. This was a girl who had been trained by life to disappear. He tried to help, in his own quiet, clumsy way. He brought her a new pair of boots from town, the leather soft and unbroken. He found an old, empty journal and a pencil and left it on the edge of her bed without a word. He spent a whole afternoon repairing the little attic window in her room, the one with the crack, so the cold drafts wouldn't stiffen her quilt at night. But Ruthie never asked for any of it. She just kept working, her small face a mask of concentration. One evening, he walked into the barn and couldn't find her. He called her name. A small voice answered from high above. He looked up. She was up in the rafters, balancing on a thick wooden beam, sweeping away decades of dust and cobwebs. Dust and straw rained down around him like dirty snowflakes. "You're trying to sweep the whole sky clean," he said, his voice echoing in the rafters. She paused, looking down at him, blinking against the dust. "It's dirty up here," she said simply. "Ain't hurting anyone." She sat down on the beam, her legs dangling in the empty air. For a long moment she was quiet. Then she spoke, her voice so low he could barely hear it. "Feels like if I stop moving, something bad will catch me." Colt stood still, the dust settling around him. The weight of her words filled the cavernous barn. "You're not being hunted anymore, Ruthie," he said softly. She didn't reply. He stepped closer, standing directly beneath her. "You're home." Her small fingers curled tighter around the wooden beam. "Sometimes," she whispered, "I forget what that means." He didn't say anything after that. He just watched her climb carefully down the ladder on her own. He went back to the house, but he left the barn lantern burning a little longer than usual, just in case she wanted to stay out and look at the stars. A week passed, then 2. March bloomed across the plains, and the creek began to swell with thawing snow from the hills. The world was waking up. And then another knock came on the door. It came in the evening, after supper. This time, it wasn't a marshal. It was a girl. Thin, pale, and barefoot, her feet blue with cold. Her cheeks were raw from windburn, and her dress was 2 sizes too small and covered in soot. She clutched something to her chest, a bundle of rags. Ruthie had been setting the table for the morning. The knock startled her. She looked to Colt, who opened the door and frowned, his face instantly hardening. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice cracking. I heard there was a ranch out here, that you took someone in." Colt stepped out onto the porch, blocking the doorway. "Who told you that?" "I don't know his name. A man in town. He's got a store. Said a man out here gave a girl his name." The girl's eyes darted around nervously, like a cornered animal. Colt glanced back at Ruthie, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then he looked at the bundle in the girl's arms. It moved. "Is that a baby?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "My brother. They tried to take him from me. The orphanage. They said I couldn't care for him, but I did. I got him out." Ruthie moved forward instinctively, drawn by the desperation in the girl's voice. "What's your name?" "Hazel," the girl choked out. Colt let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "How old are you, Hazel?" 14, she said, though she looked barely 12. "Where are your parents?" She looked away, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "Gone." Colt rubbed his forehead, the lines on his face deepening. "You walked here from town?" "I ran," she corrected him. "Hid in wagons, slept behind barns. I ain't asking for charity," she added quickly, her voice fierce. "I'll work. I'll do anything. He don't cry much, I swear it. Just don't let them take him." Ruthie didn't wait for Colt to decide. She couldn't. She walked to the door, opened it wider, and reached for the girl's cold, trembling hand. "Come in," she said softly. "Please, it's warm inside." The baby stirred in the bundle of cloth, a tiny, whimpering sound. Colt saw him then. He was so small, too small for the long road Hazel must have traveled. His face softened, the hard lines melting away. He stepped aside. They let her in. Hazel barely spoke that first night. She sat by the fire, her back ramrod straight, cradling her brother and rocking slowly, a rhythmic, protective motion she had probably been doing for days. Ruthie brought her a bowl of warm broth and a piece of bread. Hazel took one bite, and then she began to weep. Silent, heartbreaking tears, as if the simple taste of kindness had become foreign to her. That night, Colt sat at his desk for a long time, writing a letter to Bragg. He didn't know what he had started. He didn't know how many lost children would find their way to his door before the world pushed back. He didn't know how long he could keep defying the systems that wanted to keep people like Hazel and her brother invisible and silent. But he knew one thing. He couldn't turn her away. Not now. Not after Ruthie. Ruthie helped Hazel wash up in the old tin tub in the kitchen. The girl's skin was a road map of her journey, scratched and bruised from weeks on the road. She had flea bites on her ankles and her fingernails were packed with dirt. But she didn't complain once. "I can sleep by the stove," Hazel said, her voice hoarse. "I don't want to take anyone's bed." "You'll sleep in the room with me," Ruthie said, her voice firm. She grabbed her own extra blanket from the foot of her bed. "There's room." Hazel hesitated, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then she gave a small, jerky nod. Later that night, long after Hazel and the baby were asleep in her bed, Ruthie sat on a small stool in the corner of the room. She listened to the soft, even breathing of the two new souls in her home, and in the still, quiet dark, she whispered two words to no one in particular. "Thank you." 2 days passed. A fragile peace settled over the ranch. But trouble came again. This time, it wasn't a lone marshal. It was a woman, the matron of the town orphanage, a woman with a jaw as sharp as a hatchet and a collar so high it seemed to be choking her. She came riding in a wagon with 2 burly men, ready to collect Hazel and the baby like they were stray cattle. "You're harboring a runaway, Townsend," she declared, her voice like cracking ice. "She's a child," Colt replied, standing on the porch, his body blocking the door. "She is under the legal care of our institution," the matron snapped. "And that baby is an unregistered dependent. You are interfering in matters of state guardianship." "I filed papers," Colt said calmly. He held up a folded document. "Filed them this morning. Guardianship transfer request for both of them." The matron let out a short, ugly laugh. "For 2 orphans with no blood connection to you? You think Judge Harrow will sign that?" "He's the same judge that signed Ruthie's," Colt said, his voice even. "He said he'll review the case by Monday." "Then they come with me until then," the matron insisted, taking a step forward. Colt didn't move. He just stood there, tall and unyielding as an old oak tree. "No." The woman's eyes narrowed into tiny slits. "You're making enemies, Mr. Townsend." "Good," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm tired of making friends who don't fight for what's right." Inside the house, Hazel held her brother so tightly he let out a small squeak. Ruthie stood in front of her like a small, fierce guard, her jaw trembling but her eyes set. They didn't take them. The matron knew she couldn't win a physical fight, not against Colt. The wagon left, its wheels spitting gravel. But they weren't safe. Ruthie knew it. This was just a pause, a ceasefire. That night, as the girls tried to sleep, a rock smashed through the window of their room, showering the floor with glittering shards of glass. Colt was running before the second rock even hit the side of the house. He burst out the front door, shotgun in hand, but there was no one there. Just the sound of hoofbeats fading into the darkness. He didn't find the man, but he found the message. Carved into the big wooden door of the barn in thick, angry letters were 4 words. "You can't save them all." He stared at the words for a long time, the lantern light flickering on the raw wood, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew it was true, but that didn't mean he would stop trying. The next morning, Ruthie was out early again, sweeping the porch, always sweeping. It was the one thing she could control. Hazel sat on the top step, bottle-feeding the baby, her eyes heavy with lack of sleep, but brighter somehow than when she had first arrived. "You don't have to do that every day," Hazel said softly, nodding at the broom. "I know," Ruthie replied, her hands moving in a steady rhythm. "But it helps." "Helps what?" Ruthie stopped sweeping and leaned on the broom handle. "Reminds me I'm not gone." Hazel tilted her head. "Gone?" "Like before," Ruthie said, her voice quiet. "When I wasn't sure if I was a real person or just something being moved around from place to place." Hazel nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "I know that feeling." Ruthie set the broom down against the rail. She looked at Hazel, at the tiny baby in her arms, and then at the big, silent house behind them. "You'll feel real again soon," she said. Hazel gave a small, fragile smile. "I think," she whispered. "I already do." Inside the house, Colt sat at the kitchen table. He had a pen in his hand and a fresh sheet of paper in front of him. He was writing another letter. This one was longer than any before it. It wasn't to brag. It was to Judge Harrow. He wasn't just asking for guardianship anymore. He was asking for something bigger. He was asking for the right to open the ranch as a place of refuge, a legal sanctuary. Not a place for lawbreakers, but for the law forgotten, for the ones the system didn't have time to protect. He sealed the letter and looked out the window. Ruthie was laughing at something Hazel had said. Hazel was holding her brother up to the sky, and the baby was giggling. And for the first time in years, Colt felt like the house wasn't just a house anymore. It was full again. Not with noise, not with bodies, but with purpose. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would protect it, no matter the cost.